Welcome to the Target Stream for Mint Press News. I'm your host, Robert Inlakesh. As always, thank you to everyone for joining us. The Trump administration is back to its maximum pressure sanctions aimed at explicitly changing the regime in Iran. As Iran's IRGC naval forces continue to take out tankers with cruise missiles, the Yemen conflict also continues to escalate. FPV drone footage in South Lebanon returns, while the U.S. greenlights more Israeli destruction in Gaza. We're going to get into all of that and the footage that has emerged. But before we begin, the Target stream is 100% viewer funded. In the last 2 years, we were financially targeted and banned by PayPal, and our fundraisers were taken down by Indiegogo and GoFundMe. They even withheld our funds. So we are looking for 300 new members to keep this news show alive. You can join Mint Press on Patreon or right here on our YouTube membership program. With this being said, getting straight into the latest, Trump has again crashed out and threatened an economic D-Day on Iran. Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States, has issued these new sanctions and claimed that it will result in a change of the regime, a collapse of the regime in Tehran. Of course, Iran has responded by stating that this economic terrorism will not continue, will not break Iran, and ultimately they will force the United States economically to either come to the table or this will escalate again into all-out war. As a result, predictably, the prices of oil have gone up again. And so we're going to be paying more at the pump, and there's going to be, of course, less available on the market as well. Trump continues to release cope statements talking about how the Strait of Hormuz is open, but this is some footage, image from yesterday showing that another tanker was hit and was on fire. Iran has now moved forward to seizing tankers in the Strait of Hormuz as well, which is a escalation. Of course, the Trump administration really has no answers. Time and time again, it threatens these different catastrophic events, that there is going to be an economic D-Day this time. Last time and a few times before that, he was claiming that he is going to take out all of Iran's civilian infrastructure, the power plants, the bridges, the water desalination facilities. But none of that has materialized. And of course, when the United States first imposed their blockade on Iran, on top of Iran's own blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, we heard all of this talk about how Iran has only got a few months left and it's going to be drained and it's over. Look at the inflation inside of Iran. But the reality is that not only is the Iranian population accustomed to this, accustomed to a wartime economy, it went through a decade of war against Iraq as soon as the Islamic Republic was founded. It's survived all these years throughout the entire existence of the Islamic Republic system since 1979 under sanction, and the sanctions only get worse. And these sanctions that the United States are now carrying out against Iran will have some level of effect, of course, but they've already sanctioned everything. So the impact of these sanctions are not going to be anything different fundamentally to what it is currently doing. And the only thing that this really does is it indicates that the United States does not have a plan. But the US is moving in a new aircraft carrier, which has arrived in the zone of CENTCOM, US Central Command's control. They are getting rid of the USS Abraham Lincoln. And so there have been, of course, developments on that front. Meanwhile, we've seen that the US appears to be trying to amass more forces in Saudi Arabia. Specifically, this is satellite imagery revealing an expanding presence in Yanbu, the area in Saudi Arabia that has been blockaded. It's a port area near the along the Red Sea, and it is from where Saudi Arabia has been exporting its oil. It was exporting 6 million barrels of oil per day. That, of course, tapered off because Yemen's Ansarullah-led government, the Yemeni armed forces, have imposed a counter blockade on Saudi Arabia. And this counter blockade has completely prevented Saudi from using and transiting the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And of course, they have continued to strike tankers even far off of the coast in the Red Sea, where Yemen's armed forces are concentrated. They've managed to strike tankers at very long distances. We've seen these reports come up. Here's one of them. And this is, of course, also impacting the sale and the export of oil. 25% roughly of the world's oil has been stopped from flowing from the Arabian Peninsula. And Donald Trump's threats of economic sanctions and amassing forces in Saudi Arabia, presumably to take on Yemen's Ansarullah, or at least to help with the logistics of Saudi's war against Yemen, don't appear to be helping at all. We have some of the latest maps here of what's going on in the battlefield. We've seen numerous strikes around the clock targeting different areas towards the south of Yemen, where the Saudi proxy forces are concentrated, and these clashes are ongoing. We've also seen missile fire continuously at the Marib area, more towards the north of Yemen. And according to the Yemeni armed forces, hundreds of the Saudi proxy fighters and their commanders and high-ranking officials have been killed and assassinated in these ongoing drone strikes and ballistic missile and cruise missile strikes. Also, Yemen has continued to shoot down hostile drones over their airspace and imposed an equation unthinkable years ago, where Saudi fighter jets or drones simply penetrating Yemen's airspace, which in this case you've seen one here, this is an image of one recently shot down, will trigger a reaction where Yemen's armed forces fire ballistic missiles and drones towards Saudi oil facilities. We saw that earlier today, that happened yet again. And as of now, the only gains on the ground have been those areas captured by the Ansarullah-led government forces inside of Yemen. Also, and perhaps this is something that we touched on last episode that seemed to have been evolving, was Israel's push to try and capture an area, just pulling it up here on a map, right here. It's called the Aliyah Hills, and they are interpreted by the Israelis as a strategic position that have to be captured, despite the fact that there is supposedly a ceasefire in place. The Israelis, earlier in the week, they failed again in another attempt to capture the Aliyah Tahir Hills area. They used a special forces team. They were taken out with what was believed to have been an FPV drone. Israeli media are now reporting that Hezbollah fighters have planted various IEDs around this hill area. So the reason why this is so important, this zone, is because it's a strategic high ground here. It allows you to have, of course, the position overlooking Nabatea and really a large portion of South Lebanon from these hills, but also because Hezbollah is believed to have a sprawling tunnel system and missile base inside of this mountainous region here. Again, Israel has tried time and time again to capture it. This was immediately after they took the Beaufort Castle, which was, again, something that they massively bragged about. When they got there, Hezbollah decided to just use it as an opportunity to pick them off with their FPV drones, and they were sitting ducks. We saw lots of footage of Hezbollah picking off the Israeli occupation forces in South Lebanon. They picked this area. They believed it to be a massive strategic victory. In reality, Hezbollah didn't have these massive bases and tunnel systems that they were originally claiming that they did there. So they wanted to advance forward, and that's where the majority, in the final month or so, before the so-called ceasefire was implemented in Lebanon, and the Lebanese government, at the behest of the U.S., the U.S.'s proxy government in Lebanon, signed an agreement to recognize Israel. When that came into effect and Hezbollah stopped carrying out its daily operations against the Israelis and publishing video footage of it, we saw that in the lead up to that, there were various attempts to take the Aliyah Tahrir Hill, again, failed in its various attempts to take that area, and they are continuing to shell it. So here's some footage that emerged. This is all footage that you're going to look at today has come out since the last stream we did here on Monday. Here's some footage from South Lebanon. So that's some of the strikes. This is from the clashes that had been taking place, the last attempt by the Israelis to seize the Aliyah Tahrir Hills area. And last night, there was a major development. The Israelis appeared to have used what at first people were smelling from around the Nabatea area, because the shelling is concentrated on the Aliyah Tahrir Hills here, and surrounding areas, of course, where they hit them with drone strikes and artillery fire. But people in the local area and villages surrounding the Aliyah Tahrir Hills reported smelling this odd odor. And so there were fears that chemical weapons had been used. So we ended up getting some confirmation that the Israelis had, in fact, used munitions, at least incendiary munitions. It's suspected that what they were using was white phosphorus. And as a result, a Lebanese civilian choked to death, according to reports, and others were injured due to the use of white phosphorus. There are also reports that they had targeted Hezbollah fighters during a clash with the white phosphorus. We don't know their fates, but this is something that the Israelis, as a tactic, have used chemical weapons or chemical substances and white phosphorus repeatedly in South Lebanon. Before the war escalated in March and Hezbollah started responding after a 15-month period where Israel was bombing Lebanon on a daily basis. Israel committed 15,400 ceasefire violations, and Hezbollah did nothing in return. It was carrying out all these assassinations and killing everyone that you can imagine. The Israelis went after doctors, women and children, journalists, you name it. Hezbollah was not responding during that time. But what the Israelis did during that period is they started clearing out, and we'll just pull this up on a map. It's always good to see it, have the visual demonstration. So what Israel started doing in South Lebanon along the border where it had these positions, these military positions that it had set up, is it started actually spraying chemical substances at super high concentrations via planes. And so initially, even the Lebanese government appealed to the United Nations about this because this could have impacts such as spreading cancer to the local population. But the whole tactic here was to make the land to be unusable in the future, so that local villagers who wanted to return to their lands in South Lebanon couldn't return and use their land. They wanted to kill it all off. And so what Israel's strategy has been during the so-called ceasefire period, where they've only occasionally got hit by Hezbollah IEDs or FPV drones or anti-tank guided munitions over the past few months, the strategy that they've been using is to destroy civilian homes, but also to burn the agricultural lands down, to burn the olive trees, some of these, over 1,000 years old, because they want to make it uninhabitable entirely in the south of Lebanon. That is something that is their plot, their plan. And it's the same thing they did in the Gaza Strip and continue to do, by the way, during their so-called ceasefire there. We'll get into Gaza later on in the stream. But amidst their, campaign to ethnically cleanse totally the South, something that we have to note is that the US-backed Lebanese government, so the President Aoun and the Prime Minister Nawaf Salam, who are just completely owned by the United States, they signed on to this agreement, which prevents them under the agreement, which Israel is just violating and pushing forward and trying to capture more territory regardless of the agreement. But the Lebanese side, of course, has to respect it, or else the agreement is done, because we all know an Israeli ceasefire, to them, it means you cease and we fire. Very well established at this point. But they can't even, under this agreement, appeal through the United Nations, go to the international courts to try and get justice over the use of chemical munitions on their land, the burning of their agricultural land, the deliberate bombing and destruction of entire villages by the Israelis for fun, and all sorts of other crimes that are being committed by the Israelis. The Lebanese government signed an agreement where they recognize Israel and then also hand over their right to even appeal legally, which you can imagine leads us to a situation today where Hezbollah has been turning up the heat on them. So not only have a number of Israeli soldiers been killed and injured, and there's been various clashes because of Israeli forces trying to advance in the south of Lebanon recently, but now we're starting to get not only, we had a speech by Sheikh Naim Qassem recently, and it was a speech where he was outlining that the Lebanese resistance is not going to put down its weapons, that they will fight until the last drop of blood. But now we're seeing more videos come out and footage of what had been happening. This video we're going to play here, I'm just going to pull this up, is from the final days of this stage of the war. And it shows Hezbollah taking out a series of Israeli military vehicles and then targeting a group of soldiers as well. So we'll take a look at that. And that is, again, in that area above the Litani River that we were just looking at, that all of these attacks had happened. I'll take the audio out there. So here's the footage. And these clips are brand new. They haven't been released before. As a disclaimer, like we always have to give, this is not an endorsement of this content. This is for educational purposes. And so right here, what you were seeing, direct strike. The Israelis had attempted to camouflage their vehicles. And before, what they were doing is they were using fishing nets in order to try and catch the FPV drones before they hit military vehicles. And so their tanks, and you're seeing here, the previous one was, I think, a Namr armored personnel carrier that was struck. This is a D9 bulldozer, which of course cannot withstand the warheads that are placed on these FPV drones, the first-person view drones that Hezbollah has been using. Here we've got the two targets pop up. These aren't camouflaged. Again, they've targeted, in this instance, the bulldozer. It's an easier target, and it's more effective. The tanks, sometimes you can, even if you do damage to them, it's difficult for the Israelis, because then they have to tow these vehicles out. In that case, they were trying to get it right there in a weak spot of the tank. And these strikes, the majority of these drone swarm attacks, the Israelis never admitted to. So we don't have an accurate casualty count because the Israelis, quite frankly, they don't admit. We don't even know how many vehicles have been destroyed because, of course, there are these FPV drones, and Hezbollah has the footage to present to everybody, proving what they have done in these operations with their FPV drones. But also, there's a lot of other fighting that took place here again, targeting another Merkava tank, the hatch there, I believe they were going for. In the fighting in South Lebanon, Hezbollah were using the anti-tank guided missiles, which pack a bigger punch. This right here looks to be a Jeep. I'm not completely sure. But again, just to pause it here quickly, the Israelis have tried, or have been trying more recently, to camouflage their vehicles better. But of course, it doesn't work at all, and in fact, perhaps even the netting, the fish nets they were using, were a better tactic for them at stopping these drones from hitting their targets, because a few of them might have got caught occasionally in these nets. But often what happened is, when the Israelis started using the fish nets instead of trying to camouflage them, unsuccessfully evidently, but when they were using these fish nets, Hezbollah would simply just fly underneath the fish nets and hit their targets anyway. So it was pretty useless. I think it was more so that the soldiers felt better about themselves. That's my guess. Here again, they're attempting to camouflage these vehicles, and it really just, like, this does absolutely nothing. Putting a bed sheet over a tank is not going to stop an RPG round from from blowing it up. But they were getting creative with the way that they were trying to camouflage their military vehicles, their armored personnel carriers. It doesn't seem like they care too much to camouflage the D9s. This one is interesting because this drone here, which is emerging, it looks like there's been another vehicle struck there prior. Here the soldiers are, and the drone flies there. We don't obviously get a conclusive image of exactly what happened to these soldiers, but my guess is that drone got close enough to cause some serious damage to those two soldiers you see running off on the side there. So there is that. And Hezbollah evidently have a lot of this footage that is still sitting around and has not been yet released. And this, again, is just the FPV drone footage. This right here, you can see the destruction that has been caused in the area, and that military vehicle on fire there. And it shows there, it counts free soldiers, but it appears like there's actually two that are running away from the drone, and they are completely helpless. Again, the Israelis had no answer to these FPV drones and what they were capable of inflicting on their soldiers. They tried to bring in Ukrainians as experts to help them. But of course, in the war between Ukraine and Russia, both sides are using these drones, and neither of them really have a good answer. They have to just stay a long distance from each other. The front lines, they have to create longer distance because they're afraid of getting hit by these drones, and there's nothing that has been created that is an answer to be able to stop them from hitting their targets successfully. Here's another video that was also released by Hezbollah, and this is showing some of the previous footage of targets they've struck. And again, the rhetoric that is coming from Lebanese Hezbollah is escalatory. It appears as if what we're seeing here is they are on the verge of another round against the Israelis. The Israelis also, today, there was a long security meeting that the Israeli regime held for hours in the Kiryat, and that was, of course, discussing in large part the escalation in the north and attempts by the Israelis. Again, they really want to seize the Ali Tahrir Hills, and they want to push forward inside of Lebanon. They simply don't care about this, U.S. proxy regime in Beirut and what they have signed with them, because it means nothing. It's like writing a note on a piece of toilet paper for the Israelis. They don't respect Joseph Aoun. They don't respect Nawaf Salam. They don't care about these documents. And of course, Hezbollah knows this too. And it's sitting there. And every time the Israelis try to advance in South Lebanon, they are hitting them. And not too long ago, a group of Israeli soldiers entered a building in South Lebanon, and 3 of them were blown to pieces, and another 7 of them were wounded, 4 of which were said to have been in critical condition. And we just never got an update on their condition. So, you can come to your own conclusion as to what happened to them. We also never really heard much update on a lot of those casualties that were inflicted earlier on during the war, including Bezalel Smotrich's son, who apparently was lightly injured, and then it turned out, that he was actually pretty badly injured. I don't think he passed away. I think we would have confirmation of that by now if he was in fact killed by Hezbollah in South Lebanon. But it just goes to show the sort of reports that the Israeli media do, and we've shown this on the stream a number of times, that the Israelis are not transparent, and that a large portion of the reports that are published on so-called security matters, which is anything in Lebanon and Gaza to do with Iran, they first have to pass through a military censor, but they are blocked. So the military censor will block the vast majority of their stories, not allow them to report on what's happening. And of course, they don't want them to report on casualties because that looks bad. This is another video that was released. So here there's footage, and this here was a video that was sort of threatening the Israelis, and you're seeing a number of these different strikes that they carried out. There's a lot of them flying by now, but just to remind everyone of what was happening, at least 7 different Iron Dome batteries were taken out by Hezbollah's drones. And again, they couldn't do anything to stop these drone attacks from happening. And then on different positions, they took out. We're having a bit of lag here. So we're going to take that down. It's lagging for some reason there, but again, more of this footage. And so here, for example, there's Hezbollah taking out that group of Israeli soldiers with the drone and targeting them even at night. And there was a big development at the time that the night vision, that Hezbollah got night vision for its FPV drones, which enabled them to hunt down Israeli soldiers at nighttime. And another thing, of course, is, and these clips, of course, are flashing by very quickly here, because this is more of a video threatening the Israelis of escalation to come. But they did target Israeli commanders, and that is relevant to what we're about to talk about later in the stream, and that is Gaza, because Hezbollah started taking out many of these Israeli commanders who were in the units allegedly responsible for killing the 5-year-old girl Hind Rajab in the Gaza Strip, and her family, of course, and then the emergency workers who came to try and save her. And having said that, because this is a story that's now going around, Hezbollah managed to take out some of those commanders and killed people, at least in the battalion and those units that are responsible for the killing of Hind Rajab. But the Israelis are now saying, in a new whitewashing PR move, that they are not only admitting for the first time to firing on the car that was carrying Hind Rajab, but that they are opening a criminal probe into the incident. So, just so everyone is aware, I'm sure most people know of the case of Hind Rajab. This is the little girl here. She was 5 years old. She was killed in the Tel El Hawa neighborhood of Gaza City in January of 2024. This is perhaps one of the most infamous child killings during the genocide in Gaza. And so this is a very high-profile case. Many people may have seen the film that was created on the issue, recreating what happened that day, called The Voice of Hind Rajab. And so, this is something that captured the imaginations of people around the world, especially because when she was trapped in the car that she was killed in, she, for 3 hours, was pleading over the phone with Palestinian Red Crescent Society emergency workers who ended up publishing audio clips of her voice online to try and appeal to the world to put pressure on the Israelis to allow a team to come in and evacuate this little girl. So she was traveling initially in a vehicle, in a Kia, with her family, and the Israelis had issued an evacuation order at the time for all people to evacuate south. Now, they couldn't do that because the roads were all blocked. So the car was trying to find an alternate route and was opened fire upon by the Israelis. That killed 5 members of her family inside of that car initially. Later on, they executed another member of her family by opening fire once again on the car. And she was trapped inside. So it was very clear what had happened. Eventually, the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, they were in contact. They were trying to get an approval by the Israeli military to allow their paramedics to go and rescue this little girl. And obviously the audio files that were released are very traumatic of what was happening. She was too young to even understand what was happening to her. And eventually they did get that approval from the Israelis. An ambulance crew arrived, and the Israelis bombed the ambulance and then continued to fire from the tank rounds into the car and killed Hind Rajab. And so this case, again, it did capture the imaginations of the world. It's one of the most infamous, and that's why Israel has chosen this case in particular to claim that it's launching a criminal probe into it. But this is why it's really important, because Israel is doing this PR move before it tries to, again, carry out more atrocities in the Gaza Strip, because its plan, its goal, is to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And that's very clear. So if we look at the CNN piece, and of course the BBC as well and others ran with the stories that Israel is now investigating itself yet again, because the Israeli military, they had an investigation into the incident, and they said that, and this is what they said, they said that they're going to open a criminal investigation. But what did they actually say on the matter? They said the findings of the examination indicate that IDF troops fired on a vehicle that was approaching them, right? So they say, following a review of the findings and due to apparent failures in the coordination of the movement of the Palestine Red Crescent ambulance, it has been decided to open a criminal investigation into the incident by the Military Police Criminal Investigation Division. So what they're doing here is they're not doing anything. Now, the development here is one thing. And the real development is that the Israelis are now admitting to operating in the area, because for 2.5 years they denied even being in the area, and they denied, of course, opening fire, and tried to claim that Palestinians were actually responsible for this atrocity, which they very clearly committed. There were multiple investigations on the issue. Now they're saying there is a car driving towards us, and they opened fire on a car that was approaching them. Now, if this was an explanation, if we just give this to the Israelis, that this was an explanation as to why they opened fire and fired 335 bullets into the car, then, okay, at what time was it heading towards you? Interesting. Are they proposing the idea that a 5-year-old girl surrounded by the bodies of 6 family members, terrified, was able to command a vehicle that had already been shot up and drive it at the Israelis? Is that what they were claiming? Because that's a very interesting claim if that is the case. But of course, forensic architecture, and there was a number of investigations using satellites and forensics, they evaluated the scene and they found that this was the angle that the tank fired on the car at. And they also found that the evidence proved that they would have been able to see people inside the car. They would have been able to identify. Plus, on top of that, there were 2 vehicles that they struck. One of the vehicles that they hit, by the way, was the ambulance, and they committed a double tap strike. They bombed it twice to make sure that the emergency workers were dead. Okay, so now they're going, oh, well, yeah, it was a mistake. It was driving towards us. That's their narrative now. Amidst that, however, what they did is, and nobody's talking about this is not in the headlines, Israel's investigating itself now. This was completely ignored. I don't know if anyone remembers this case, but the World Central Kitchen, it's 7 of its employees were killed in a series of drone strikes that were carried out in 2024 by the Israelis, precision drone strikes. These were clearly marked vehicles, and members of the World Central Kitchen attempted to evacuate into different cars, and they hit them again. They double tapped them. And Israel, investigating now around 500 of its cases, it just ruled out 3. This is one of them, one of the cases that they ruled out, and absolved their forces of any accountability, of any criminal wrongdoing in this case. So that's not been in the media. But just so everyone is aware of the situation, because this, of course, is important. Do you want to take a guess at what Israel's history is with punishing its soldiers in Gaza through these criminal probes and all of the rest of it? Well, the largest probe that they opened in 2014, in the 2014 war, they said 70 Palestinian civilians were killed in this incident. It was actually around 120, but of course, this is the Jerusalem Post. It's a, Israeli rag. But they closed the investigation into this at the time. This was one of the worst incidents in the war. They launched an investigation into it, indiscriminately bombed, triggered the Hannibal to Palestinian civilians, and then they just closed down the investigation and said, no, we're not doing anything about it, because it was all for show. It was about whitewashing. And this is the Israeli, I'm going to pull this down for a second, because everyone should be aware of, seems like we're having problems here. Everyone should be aware of what the accountability looks like for Israeli soldiers. So the worst ever sentence for an Israeli soldier of committing crimes or their conduct in Gaza was not for killing civilians, was not for brutal forms of torture, rape, all the rest of the things that we know are proven, not for using human shields, which there's copious evidence of the Israeli soldiers using Palestinians as human shields. No, the worst sentence ever was for a soldier stealing a credit card, and they were sentenced in 2009 to 7.5 months in prison for stealing a credit card. That's it. That's the worst sentence ever for an Israeli committing a crime against a Palestinian in Gaza. 7.5 months for stealing a credit card. That's the sort of accountability that the Israelis, they're responsible for. They don't hold their forces accountable, of course, right? That's something that's very well known at this point. But the case of Hind Rajab is being used here to say, look, we're investigating ourselves 2.5 years afterwards, and now they're just presenting another excuse. There was the case last year of the Israelis executing at close range 15 Palestinian first responders, emergency workers, paramedics, and then burying their bodies in a mass grave along with the ambulances and other emergency vehicles that they were driving in. And the Israelis, initially, everyone thought that they had been kidnapped because they couldn't find them. When people went in and discovered the mass graves, they then started to, of course, accuse the Israelis of what the evidence presented, that these people were lined up and executed in some cases. They fired, the Israelis in that case, 900 bullets. 900 bullets at these emergency workers. Initially, the Israelis said, oh, well, actually, they didn't have their lights on and we mistook them for militants coming towards us. Sound familiar? This is the same excuse they're using now in the case of Hind Rajab. There's a vehicle heading towards us, so we opened fire, which absolves them of any accountability. It's like we're acting in self-defense. That's their claim. So they claim that, and then the video footage was released from someone's personal device, one of those emergency workers that was killed. And that proved that it was the exact opposite. Their emergency lights were on. It was very clear. They were in clear marked vehicles, and the Israelis opened fire on them anyway. Then they changed their narrative after that came out, and they said, oh yeah, but we didn't think that they were just emergency vehicles. We thought that they were, we misinterpreted it as a threat. And then they even demoted some people, some soldiers, because they said, oh, they provided they provided bad information. Then they came out with a claim that, oh yeah, but 6 of the 15 are actually terrorists from Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And now they've said, oh yeah, we have to look into that as well. And there was perhaps misconduct and miscommunication on behalf of our forces. You coordinated. The ambulances coordinate with the Israeli military everywhere they go. The same with Hind Rajab. In the case of Hind Rajab, it was an international event. It was all over the media. They knew exactly what they were doing. But again, they want to present this. So in the media, they sell you this ridiculous narrative that Israel is trying to hold its soldiers to account, that Israel is admitting some level of fault. And it won't. Because even when 10 Israeli soldiers, were filmed on camera in the Sedtiman detention facility, where they rounded up Palestinians from Gaza without a charge and threw them into this torture detention camp that was compared to Guantanamo Bay. And some said, their commentary on the conditions said it's worse than Guantanamo Bay. It's worse than Abu Ghraib that the Americans operated in Iraq. That it's worse than these facilities. There is footage of 10 Israeli soldiers committing gang rape against a Palestinian, video footage of it. You know what happened? They initially arrested them. Then there were protests for the right to rape. Israeli ministers were up in arms about it, saying that they had the right to do this. Israeli protesters stormed military bases, attacked police stations, advocating for freeing these rapists. And what ended up happening? Well, they dropped all of the charges of sexual abuse and rape against all of these soldiers. I think they only ended up pursuing charges, minor charges, against 4 of them. And they said, oh, they convicted them. No, they didn't. Not of the crimes that they committed. And of course, it's just slap on the wrist stuff to these people. They commit these heinous acts, and then Israeli society is in uproar when they're punished. There was the case, for example, I believe it was in 2016, of an Israeli soldier. This is the worst sentence ever given. I believe it was 14 months in prison for this soldier. This is the worst sentence ever given, to my memory, of an Israeli soldier for killing a Palestinian in the West Bank. And what happened is there was a soldier, his name was Ilor Azaria. A Palestinian was already wounded, shot on the floor in the West Bank city of Al Khalil. And then he walked up, and it was all filmed. This is all on video. He walked up to the Palestinian who's already wounded on the ground and shot him in the head. Now, then suddenly, because there's backlash on the media, the Israelis are like, we have to do something. We have to, show that our legal system is functioning. And so there were protests against this. And the Israeli society raised money for him and made him rich because of this. And most of his time in prison, it was over a long period of time, it wasn't like a proper prison sentence, and it was 14 months they ended up getting in the end for an explicit execution on video of someone who is unarmed laying on the floor. That's the worst, and that created such uproar in Israeli society, and they raised money for this guy, that after that, the Israeli soldiers were able to push the boundaries of what's possible for them and how they're allowed to operate. There were no rules of engagement after that, because they saw this guy, it took a long time to get there as well, only got 14 months. This guy became rich because Israelis raised money for him because they thought that what he did was such a good thing and that he should be celebrated for executing an unarmed person laying on the floor already wounded. That's the Israeli military. That's the accountability. The blatant execution of Shireen Abu Akleh in 2022, the Palestinian-American journalist. Again, the Israeli forces then went forth, and what they did is they decided to attack the funeral. So the pallbearers almost dropped her coffin, fired tear gas when her body was being carried into a church, and they lied and doctored the Israeli police, doctored footage, right? CCTV footage to lie about them attacking the funeral and try and blame it on Palestinians for instigating the violence. And then, of course, initially they blamed Palestinian fighters in Jenin for the execution of this journalist. Now, why am I saying all of this? Because Israel's latest PR push, and this is what it normally does, it puts out this nonsense, right? Ruling out the cases of the World Central Kitchen and other attacks on aid workers, which are very clearly done with precision strikes, and they know where they're located. They ruled out these, but now they're presenting this narrative in the media that there's going to be accountability. Why? Because now they're pushing an agenda on the Gaza Strip where they're seeking to have what's called an international stabilization force sent into Gaza, an invasion force. And so far it looks like Moroccan soldiers and Ugandan soldiers will be sent in to participate in this so-called international stabilization force, an invasion force. And the Trump administration is already handing over $206 million for this force. So they are steamrolling ahead with this agenda in Gaza. There was a plan presented before by Hamas, and it was agreed to by all of the Palestinian resistance factions with the so-called Board of Peace, controlled by the US and really the Israelis have the final say on everything with the so-called Board of Peace. It's the Israeli, the Board of Israel. And the plan was for a disarmament, a phased disarmament where Hamas would store its weapons. First, the police, for example, would hand over their weapons to a new Palestinian police force, and that this would be gradual during an Israeli full withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. And then there would be a plan while Hamas goes to store its weapons and to take them out of commission, that they would have reconstruction and a path to Palestinian statehood. That was what was agreed upon. The Israelis had a stink about it. And then so Jared Kushner recently went over along with a group of representatives for the Board of Peace and the Trump administration to meet with Israeli officials. The Israelis basically told them, yeah, we're not going to allow that. Hamas has to disarm first before we withdraw from Gaza and before we even think about reconstruction. Jared Kushner claimed that there was a reconstruction plan. There is no reconstruction plan. He has no plan at all. He's completely incompetent. And now what we're seeing is there's a green light given to the Israelis to go forward and commit more massacres in Gaza. And that's exactly what they started doing. As soon as Jared Kushner visited, we got instantly these massacres that were being carried out. One of which, and we can't show you, of course, the close-up footage of what happened. One was an attack on police forces in Gaza, and they killed both male and female police commanders in the Gaza Strip, because again, there's already a plan in place where Hamas has agreed to hand over the civil administration to a technocratic body. They've already agreed for their police to hand over their weapons. But Israel just wants to kill them for the sake of killing them, because they're never going to go through with any of these plans. They're never going to go through with the so-called ceasefire conditions. This is something I said back in October of 2025 when this ceasefire agreement was agreed upon. Israel will get its captives out of Gaza, will release some of the Palestinian prisoners, but not all of them. And then we will be in limbo between phase 1 and phase 2. There is no phase 2. There's no Gaza reconstruction plan. It doesn't exist. There's a bunch of AI-generated images that were put together on a lousy, lazy PowerPoint plan that was presented publicly at the start of the year by Jared Kushner. There's no plan to rehabilitate Gaza at all. There's no plan for there to be a free flow of aid into Gaza. In fact, they continue to attack medical facilities. They continue to block aid from coming into the territory. They continue to assassinate prominent people within different families and different areas in the Gaza Strip to create chaos, to foment fighting, to destabilize the territory. And they continue to back, arm, train 5 different ISIS-linked militia groups, a bunch of criminals, thugs, and Takfiri Salafists that they are using to fight against Hamas. These people will go into areas of Gaza that are supposed to be under the de facto control of Hamas for now, and they will try and kidnap people, women and children. They will try and raid hospitals. And so the Palestinian resistance formed what's known as the Arrow Unit, which was responsible for combating these thugs and for dealing with them and taking them out. And so they have been capturing people affiliated with them, and they have been taking them out when they come into the territory that is currently where the majority of the Palestinian people live. There's like a few thousand others that are living in the Israeli-controlled zone. The only reason they're there is just it's the militants themselves, these terrorists, and then it's the families of the terrorists, or part of those families of these terrorists that are in the zone that Israel controls, which is more than 60% of Gaza now. So Israel's ramping up for this. So if you thought the conditions and you've learned anything about the predicament of Gaza and what it was like in the lead up to October 7, and you understand why something like that would happen, What is happening now in Gaza almost guarantees that what we're going to see in the future is something that will have absolutely not one single iota of mercy when it explodes. And this is something that they are creating. And this is why I want to go on record with this. Israel is creating its own disasters ahead of it. And it will suffer at the hands of those whose children have been slaughtered, their wives have been killed, their mothers killed. They will suffer at their hands immensely because of the fact that they are forcing them into a corner where there's nothing left. And it might not happen immediately, but I can guarantee you that what will end up happening and what will end up coming is something that the Israelis will not be able to deal with. And it can happen one of two ways. It can happen during an escalation with the rest of the Iranian allied axis of resistance factions, or it will happen on its own because they will be forced into that position. If it happens in the context of a regional confrontation, I expect that Israel won't exist after it. And they can cry and they can whine and they can moan about everything that's going to happen when this eventually occurs. And everything has been brought upon themselves. Everything. The people in Gaza, 2/3 of them are in these tents and these facilities. These tents, which are worn down, which are old, which they constantly have to patch up, they have nothing. And they're just leaving them in this position. And then anytime Hamas or any of the Palestinian factions come and make an agreement to try and give control to another body controlled by, they know, the Board of Peace, which in its charter doesn't mention Gaza or Palestine once. They know it's the US and Israel that control it. But they want to find a solution because their population is suffering so immensely. And by the way, for those people, oh, Hamas, this crazy, kooky terrorist organization that could never possibly make an agreement, and that's why Israel has to go after it. Just so everyone is aware, after Hamas took power, number one, they were pressured by the Gulf states, pressured by the British, pressured by the United States to run in the elections, the legislative elections, Palestinian legislative elections in 2006. When they ran in those elections, which before they were opposed to the entire Palestinian Authority system. They were just about doing resistance and, providing social services, and, that was their function. When they ran and they won in a landslide, they didn't really know what to do. But immediately, the United States and the European Union said that, well, we're not recognizing the results of a democratic election that we pushed you to get involved in, and we're going to sanction you. And so immediately, Hamas are under sanction, right? Immediately, someone like Ismail Haniyeh, he can't be the Palestinian prime minister because the United States, the European Union, and the Israelis won't allow for that to be the case. So now Gaza is isolated immediately. And Gaza is under a siege at this time, remember. Then the Bush administration, with full complicity of the Israelis, starts funneling weapons on the black market and money to Palestinian Preventative Security Force head Mohammed Dahlan. And Dahlan was preparing to lead a military coup in the Gaza Strip to replace Hamas. Hamas saw it coming, and the Qassam brigades thwarted the coup attempt. Later on, Dahlan would become sort of the head guy for Emirati intelligence, right? He would, facilitate all sorts of stuff in the Horn of Africa, all the way into Eastern Europe. He's his own character now. He still does have people that he pays inside of Palestine, and he has a role there. Perhaps we'll get into that in another time. But he was exiled from the Palestinian Authority because they didn't like how powerful he was getting, right? By the Ramallah-based Palestinian Authority, whose unelected president is Mahmoud Abbas. So then there's this civil war. They call it the Palestinian Civil War in 2007. Hamas takes over the Gaza Strip. Israel, by the way, was already bombing Gaza at that point. And there's an attempt to bring the factions together. It doesn't work. And there was never any chance for them to possibly make any better of their situation. 2008-9, Israel comes in, kills thousands. 2012, again, a massive Israeli bombardment. 2014, thousands of Palestinian civilians killed in Gaza as the weapons of the Palestinian armed faction start to develop a little bit more. And the Israelis had no military option for the Gaza Strip, by the way, at this point. Their forces, they attempted a ground invasion in 2014, and the ground invasion failed. It failed. Hamas managed to inflict massive casualties upon them. It took prisoners, for example, during the 2014 war, or you can't really call it a war, extermination campaign. And Israel would just do these periodic massacres. Now, when Yahya Sinwar, who was assassinated in Gaza in 2024, when he took over Hamas in Gaza, became the leader of Hamas in Gaza, instantly he started making reforms. So Hamas came out with a new charter in 2017, condemned anti-Semitism, and it also said that Hamas would agree to a two-state solution. And it was open and tried to reach out to the Americans to negotiate. Of course, all of this fell on deaf ears. There was nothing. They tried to unify with the Palestinian Authority like they did in 2014. But of course, Israel ruined the 2014 unity attempt by bombing Gaza. That was a large part of the reason why they attacked Gaza in the way they did, is to prevent there being unity between Hamas and Fatah that runs the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. They wanted to divide the two territories. 2017 comes, suddenly the Israelis are putting a lot of pressure on the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority has many people under it that used to work as its employees in Gaza, and they still get a salary. Because, of course, people in Gaza are poor, and most of them don't have jobs. And so they get these salaries, which enables them to buy food, pay for their accommodation, etc. So Israel starts stopping the money coming, the tax revenue coming back to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority slashes its wages for its employees in Gaza. So that happens. There's also an attempt to bring together the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, and for Hamas to hand over control of the civil administration of Gaza, which we keep hearing throughout this entire genocide. Oh, if Hamas just handed over control and Hamas can't be in control. They tried. They signed an agreement with the Palestinian Authority. There were Palestinian Authority security forces who were deployed to Rafah, the border crossing between Gaza and Egypt. Palestinians in Gaza, throughout Gaza, celebrated this. But then there was pressure from the Israelis and the Americans, and so the Palestinian Authority was forced to back out of this, and the whole thing ended up deteriorating. Then, this is at the end of 2017. In 2018, Hamas then endorsed the Great Return March, and they say that we'll do nonviolence. For the entirety of the initial phase of the Great Return March, Hamas did not respond militarily to anything Israel did. There were hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who came to the separation barrier, which was incorrectly described as a border. It's not a border. And Israel hasn't even ever declared its borders, so there's no such thing as an Israeli border anyway, technically, let alone when it comes to Gaza. But when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians came out, Israel tried to provoke Hamas. because they wanted an excuse to massacre more people and stop the protests, because the protests were a nuisance. They still killed hundreds of civilians and injured tens of thousands of civilians. They had no problem in doing that. And they published videos of them laughing while they shoot Palestinian children with snipers, and they just get practice, right, shooting Palestinians with snipers. Hamas decided not to engage. Israel would bomb facilities. They tried to assassinate people. They do all of this. And Hamas didn't respond with rocket fire or any violence until Israel ran a raid where they tried to kidnap a Hamas commander later in the year. I believe it was in November of 2018. Then Hamas militarily responded to the Israelis. They tried every tactic in the book. And what happened? Israel kept on putting more and more pressure on. The only thing that Israel would do to stop things from completely exploding and control the situation, because they know they had no military solution, they couldn't defeat Hamas or the Palestinian resistance factions militarily. They tried to inflict blows. They know they cannot endure. The Israeli military are too cowardly and too weak to be able to sacrifice enough soldiers that it is needed to actually go after the Palestinian factions and to fight them directly and engage in a real war. They know that. So what they did is they didn't want to go to an escalation at this point. So they decided that they'd allow for Qatar, which has open relations with the Israelis. Israelis can travel to Qatar, right? There's a consulate there. There's all of that. They, although there's not this formal recognition, there's still open relations between the Israelis and the Qatari. And so the Qataris were instructed, give some funds to Gaza, which is why you hear all this stuff about the suitcases, right? Which initially happened with suitcases, and then it was just transfers in other ways that it came into Gaza, which didn't just happen because of Benjamin Netanyahu, by the way. There was Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett, who were prime minister for their respective periods of time between Netanyahu's two different reigns, the most recent one and one before. And during their time as well, there was also funds coming into Gaza. And the whole point of that was to prevent Hamas from putting pressure on, from firing rockets into the neighboring Israeli settlements in response to Israeli attacks, and to stop any sort of escalation that would occur with Hamas militarily. They wanted to just bury the issue, strangle Gaza, and the tactic was to force the Palestinians to rise up against Hamas inside of the territory. That's what they wanted. And they were encouraging this. And there were a number of different projects that the Israelis set up to stir division inside society and get riots going against Hamas, similar to how they tried to do things in Iran to overthrow the Iranian government. Very similar. So they putting on all this pressure. Netanyahu got back into office after Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid were in. And by the way, Yair Lapid did a massive bombing campaign in 2022 and killed a whole bunch of children and civilians when he was in power. He's supposed to be the most moderate Israeli that also wants the Greater Israel Project and openly says that he wants to expand Israel's borders all the way into Iraq when he was asked a question about it. So the moderate guy, in his background, Yair Lapid, he's somebody who comes from a television presenter background. He had to prove himself to the Israeli society. See, I'm a murderous monster as well. You don't have to be a general or a Mossad agent in order to butcher children in Gaza. You can be a TV presenter as an Israeli and also kill children just the same way your predecessors did. So he had to prove himself. And his whole tactic when he was launching his attack campaign, his major attack on Gaza, was to go after Palestinian Islamic Jihad and target them because they wanted to divide the Palestinian groups against each other. They wanted Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, is the second largest resistance group in the Gaza Strip. They wanted to divide them. So they specifically didn't target Hamas and went after Islamic Jihad to try and make them clash over things and create problems between them. Netanyahu comes back in. Suddenly we've got a situation where there's all of this agitating that's going on. And they're trying to push further into Al-Aqsa Mosque. They're forcing more people out of their homes in East Jerusalem. the situation has already deteriorated. Back in 2020, the situation in Gaza was already deemed unlivable, the territory. So Hamas tried everything. They tried a new charter which condemns anti-Semitism, which accepts a two-state solution. They tried unifying and handing over control of the civil administration of Gaza to the Palestinian Authority, which is, the okayed version of Palestine, and the only Palestinian political party which is accepted by the West, terrorist organization, is the mainstream branch of Fatah, which runs the PA, right? Because the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is there for one thing. It is for providing security coordination for the Israelis, to protect the settlers, to protect the Israelis, and to do the Israelis' dirty work for them and take the task of policing the Palestinian population centers in the West Bank off of the Israeli soldiers. It's exhausting and it's expensive. So they got Palestinians to do it for them, right? Hamas knows all of this, by the way, right? All of the Palestinian factions do. And they all agreed, yeah, hand over control of the civil administration, endorse nonviolent struggle, right? Say you'll accept a two-state solution. Hamas did all of this, all of it. And still, what would Israel do? Knowing it has no proper military solution, and by a military solution, I don't mean a genocide or ethnic cleansing. I mean an actual military solution for fighting, which, again, it never fought the Palestinian resistance. It's done assassinations, but it's never had a war with Palestinian fighters, ever. Palestinian fighters brought the war to them. They never went after them because they're cowards. They're the diaper brigades, and they hide and they scurry away, and they like to bomb from a distance and then shoot up cars in Tel al-Hawa or wherever in Khan Yunis and whatever, full of children and civilians. That's what they like to do. And that's the nature of the Israelis, of the Israeli occupation forces. That's what they're there to do. And so now, what's happening? That same irrational mentality of seeing a group in Gaza that is willing to compromise greatly, that is willing to hand over control, that is now even willing to pursue a plan to disarm itself, the only chips it has left in this game, the only card it has to play is that it has arms to repel Israeli attacks, or at least to kill Israeli soldiers when they come in and they start killing tens of thousands of civilians. The only thing they have left, they're willing to give it up. And the Israelis say no. So what do you think is going to happen, realistically speaking, out of this scenario? I think it's pretty clear. One thing we're talking about earlier, these FPV drones, that's something that's very interesting. It's not out of the realm of possibility that we could see these eventually introduced into the West Bank. In fact, I would suspect that in the West Bank there are already FPV drones, but they will have to build up a stockpile and they will have to train people on them. Now, that's where the situation in the West Bank comes into this, because in Gaza, the Israeli plan, the Israeli plot in Gaza is to ethnically cleanse its people. That's what it wants to do. It wants to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian population, and it will continue pursuing this policy of not really having a plan, but just making the people suffer in Gaza for as long as they have to, with the intent of eventually having an event where they could drive them out of their homes. But in the West Bank, they will have to manufacture a different situation. The predicament that the people face there is obviously different to Gaza. One thing that is very different from the Gaza Strip, however, which makes it more risky, you can't just go in and destroy every single building in the West Bank. That's not something that you can do, because the West Bank, unlike Gaza, these maps are labeled wrong. So, we're not getting an accurate representation of what things are actually called here, but just for the sake of this video and displaying on screen. So if everyone obviously can notice, Gaza is completely flat terrain here. The West Bank, it's got like mountainous areas, it's very hilly, which makes it a better terrain for fighting, number one. Also, there are settlements which are scattered throughout the West Bank, all over the place. There's settlements in the Jordan Valley area. There's settlements around Jenin and Nablus and Ramallah, Beit Lahem and Al-Khalil. All right, everywhere there's Israeli settlements, which means if the Palestinian factions in the West Bank get their hands on FPV drones, which are pretty easy to use, cheap to acquire, and also the number one thing about them is make it hard to detect who's firing them. They can cause enormous problems for the Israelis because they can just fly these drones, which can go like 10 miles in distance, into Israeli settlements, and they can hit settlers and Israeli checkpoints, take out Israeli military targets with ease. And one of the problems in the West Bank with any small resistance factions that have popped up is that there's a lot of spies in the West Bank. And it's not just Israeli spies that they have to worry about. It's also Palestinian Authority spies. In fact, the resistance that emerged in the Jenin refugee camp, in the old city of Nablus, in Tulkarem, in Nur al-Shams refugee camp, the resistance factions that emerged there, they were primarily young people. But they were in such a terrible predicament because there were all these young people that wanted to resist. They got their hands on weapons. And then you had people coming in, like we were talking about Mohammed Dahlan before. There are figures like Dahlan that will funnel money to some places. Then there's the faction within Fatah of the Palestinian Authority that also wanted to have control over some of these fighters and what they were doing. Because at that point, the fighters were only able to really attack the Israelis defensively. So they plant these like homemade bombs on the roads, so the Israeli military jeeps would come and get blown up when they illegally raid their areas to come and kidnap children in the nights and just stuff they normally do in the West Bank. If you ever go there, that's just what you see all the time. The Israelis like to kidnap children at night, fire tear gas into people's homes, ransack the houses, use houses as military outposts and detention facilities for people in an area if they choose to for a few days, and then they'll defecate on their floors and rub it on the walls and do all the stuff that you've seen them do in Gaza and in South Lebanon, and I'm sure they'll be doing in Syria as well at some point as well. So that's the way that the Israelis obviously operate on a daily basis in the West Bank, just making life harder for people for absolutely no reason, because they hate people who are not from their special ethno-religious category, because it's an apartheid regime, right? So why not? It's fun to have a child cry as you beat his dad into an inch of his life in his living room. And then you go into the child's room and you destroy his drawings, and you smear your own feces over his drawings. That's the sort of stuff that the Israelis like to do. And by the way, this is the stuff that I've witnessed, not the actual smearing of the feces, but the aftermath of that. I had the delight of seeing this stuff and them going into houses and raiding them at night and getting tear gassed at night in the West Bank, right? That's just a common feature. So this is not something I'm just saying from reading about it. I've seen this happen, okay? This is normal stuff that they do, right? So these young people who are pissed off about this grabbed weapons and they started trying to form these resistance groups. Palestinian authorities trying to get in with those resistance groups and influence them. You have people like Dahlan who are trying to influence them, right? And then you have all of these spies everywhere from the Palestinian Authority will tell on everyone. And the Palestinian Authority spies are more efficient. The Palestinian Preventative Security Forces, they're probably more efficient. They have more intelligence that they share with Israel than the Israelis have to get themselves. They don't even have to do it. They still spy on Palestinians themselves. They don't fully trust the PA to do it all for them, but they get all the intelligence. They coordinate. And the reason why the resistance, like the Jenin Battalion and all of these groups that popped up in the West Bank, no longer exist is because of the Palestinian Authority. Quite frankly, that's the reason they're not there. Now, the Israelis, as well as collective punishment, what they did is they decided to go in and destroy the entire Jenin refugee camp, blow up all the buildings there, go and do all their disgusting stuff in the mosques. And they did the same in Nur Shams refugee camp and displaced tens of thousands of people. And so that resistance there, the remaining elements of it had to go underground. But I guarantee it is still there. And there's some inkling of that. We've seen videos here and there of them. Occasionally, these groups like Suraya al-Quds, the armed wing of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, carrying out these IED attacks and stuff on Israeli military vehicles. Occasionally, there's stuff now. But these guys had to go underground, right? And people they sacrificed their guns and handed it over, and they handed themselves to the Palestinian Authority, and they remain in Palestinian Authority detention. Some of them tortured to within an inch of their life. That's the situation there, and they're in a very difficult position. However, if there are units of these, they have their cadres of these resistance groups that can pop up in the West Bank, they get their hands on FPV drones, changes the scenario drastically in the West Bank, because you have small groups of fighters. And the Israelis, by the way, are talking about this, and they're scared of this being, eventually happening. This is something that really has spooked them, and their think tanks are talking about it, and they are paranoid about this because it takes a few of them. They have a little bit of experience, and then they can fire off these drones, and it's very hard to track where they are unless somebody tells. So they might be able to start launching attacks where people don't actually have to go to jail, and get tortured and raped inside of Israel's rape dungeon prisons, or get executed and their house is blown up for committing these attacks. It will enable them to evade detection better than before. So this is something the Israelis are greatly fearing, and I guarantee you there is a lot of movements to try and to get these weapons in the hands of fighters there. So that's something that I thought there was somebody as well, I saw in the comment section before, that was asking to address the West Bank resistance and the state of it. People may have, known about some of the groups that existed before. Now they've just sort of gone underground. A lot of the leaders of those groups have been assassinated or imprisoned by either the Israelis or the Palestinian Authority. So like Arin al-Asud and these groups, they're no longer really in proper existence. Now, the guys that were part of like Arin al-Asud and in Nablus and the Jenin brigades and all the others that popped up, a lot of them are still around, but again, they've been sort of driven underground. And because, again, of the Palestinian Authority and its role, the situation in the West Bank nothing's happened since the genocide in Gaza, and it sort of depressed people and deterred them from doing anything in the way of armed struggle. So that's sort of the scenario right now in the West Bank. I wouldn't count it out that there will be something, but the Israelis are doing all the aggression. The Israelis are the one planning everything. So if there is anything that they can use as an excuse in the West Bank as, in order to go further and expel even more people, they'll do it. And they want to annex as much of that territory as possible and push out as many people. That's their goal. And unlike Gaza, there is no proper resistance in the West Bank. There's small groups of young people who take up arms, and they might put out videos, where they look like SWAT teams and stuff like that. But these are just young guys that don't have any formal training who just decide to fight because they've had enough. And it's primarily the people from the refugee camps. It's not the people from the actual cities, right? Or in the case of Nablus, it's the old city, which is where, the poorer people live, right? There's a very complex situation that has been set up in the West Bank where they've sort of, there's this NGOization of the territory where NGOs go in and people want to be employed by NGOs, right? And they want to get grants. So if you're a Palestinian community and you've got an Israeli settlement that is expanding into your territory, a few NGOs, Western NGOs, will pop up at your door. They'll locate the prominent members of the community who are leading, protest movements or whatever it may be, and they will approach them and they'll guide them into doing things the way that basically Israel wants them to do, and silencing them and policing their language and trying to change the way that they behave. But it's not only that. These NGOs will target different people in the same family or different people, prominent people who have normally egos when they're leader types in certain communities, and they will pay them both. And then some funding will dry up and one of them will go over to paying the other one, something like this. And then they'll get them to fight with each other. So you divide an entire movement, whether it's just a protest movement, whatever it may be, right? Whatever projects are going on to oppose settlement expansion. So you destroy that. Another tactic in the West Bank that they've used for the banking system and interest, right? They go and they offer these people these loans. The banks offer loans very easily for people in the West Bank. So then they get them into debt slavery. They offer them credit cards very easily in the West Bank. So, and again, the unemployment rate is high, and it's got a lot higher since October 7th. It's one of those pressure points on the West Bank and a predictor of it exploding at one point. But, a large portion of the employed population of the West Bank are employed by the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority, if you want to continue having the money to pay for your house and to pay for your family, and you get to have a gun and respect and whatever, and they'll send you, like the people from the security forces of the PA, they take them from some areas and they use them in another area, right? So they have, less consideration about what they're doing often to these people in different areas, right? This is a tactic they used all over the world, right? But people are not going to want to revolt or say anything that's challenging the Israeli occupation or siding with resistance or stepping out of line with the PA because it pays them or it pays somebody they know. And then if you resist the Israelis, then Israel will come and detonate your house and your family will be homeless and they'll kill you and probably kill members of your family. So they trap you. The West Bank is such a sophisticated prison system. And this is not even getting into how the settlements are strategically placed to divide the territory, the checkpoints, all of the little efforts and the psychological operations that are carried out against different populations within that territory. They did a number on the West Bank to divide them, to ensure that they couldn't resist. Because naturally you want to resist. And, if you see Palestinians in the West Bank, you ask them their opinions on Israel and what it's doing to Gaza, they'll tell you how outraged they are. But again, you're taking the tools away from them. You're putting stranglehold over them. You're dividing them. That's what they do. It's all insidious. Like everything they do there is targeting the people. They don't want them to live by themselves. They want them to leave. So they are trying every single insidious tactic in the book to screw them over and get them to leave, let alone even thinking about resistance, right? In Gaza, it's different. They besieged Gaza, and the resistance groups in Gaza took over the territory because they were forced to, basically. There was an attempt at a coup against them, and then suddenly they're surrounded, and they're like, well, we're going to keep building weapons, and we're going to try and fight. That was Gaza. And the history of the Palestinian struggle, there's a reason why it was easier for, on the outside for it to happen, right? The Palestinian resistance, the PLO, had its base in Jordan. And for a long time, the Jordans kicked them out in 1970, right? They cracked down upon them. I wonder who was behind forcing that to happen. And then they were expelled into Lebanon and Beirut. And then Israel pursued them into Beirut. Anywhere Palestinians go, they just don't want them to exist anywhere. They want to just exterminate them. They want to make sure that they are out of existence. Even if they flee to a Western country, they can't be treated as normal. They can't get away from it. You know, everywhere, like you open your mouth as a Palestinian and you're going to get persecuted. That's their system. And again, the rage after committing one of the worst atrocities in modern history in Gaza, the rage and the desire for revenge is not suddenly going to go away. So expect resistance. Expect never-ending resistance until there is no Israel. That's what's guaranteed to happen. And these people will come along and talk Hamas this and blah, blah, blah. It's just all excuses. It's human nature that groups of people are going to resist. And that's what we're going to see. That's going to continue to happen, whether they are Islamic groups or nationalist groups or Marxist groups or anything. It doesn't matter. People resist when you kill their families and try and remove them from their homes. They resist. And in the case of Gaza, basically everyone in Gaza is a refugee anyway. You've already expelled them once from their homes. So what's being expelled again? Let's fight, because we're living in an unlivable territory anyway. Let's fight. Now you've taken all the buildings away. You've taken a functioning health system away. You've taken everything. Now, what do you expect eventually to happen, to come out of this? And you think the people in the West Bank aren't angry about this? Do you think people across the region aren't angry that there's not going to be any repercussions for these actions? Of course there is. It's so incredibly predictable. We were going to get into the Syria predicament because there were some Israeli airstrikes that were committed, some satellite imagery against the runway here in an airbase called Abu Duhur, which is located in Idlib in northwestern Syria. Again, this is the satellite imagery just depicting where the runways have been destroyed. Syria doesn't actually have an air force because Israel just destroyed the air force and took out most of its strategic weapons. But the Turkish military have been attempting to revive Syria's air defenses and its air force because, the Turkish military want to have, a foothold inside of Syria. They want to stabilize the situation so it doesn't blow up in their face. They're very afraid of that happening, and they would like to assert their power. But the Turkish influence on the government in Damascus is very limited because the US owns that government. Turkey is a NATO ally, and it can have a role inside of Syria, but it can't push certain boundaries. So Israel, every time the Turkish military does something in Syria that they don't want, Israel decides that it will bomb them, it will blow them up, because, that's just what it does. And here, just for the record, this came out on Reuters. Let's pull this up real quick. So the head of the Mossad actually had a phone call with the Syrian foreign minister, Assad Shebani. He had an open phone call just before the strikes warning about Turkish military involvement inside of Syria. Now, Syria denies there was any Turkish military presence in this airfield. Turkey is trying to deny anything as well. Turkish soldiers have been killed by Israeli airstrikes, I believe, last year. They did nothing. And quite frankly, Israel is the one aggressing here. Israel wants a foothold inside Syria. Israel is occupying Syrian territory. And Turkey is not demonstrating that it'll do anything to defend itself. Turkey wants to have influence. It wants to be like this regional trade hub that utilizes the middle corridor of trade running through, and it doesn't want to rock the boat. So, Erdogan, he comes out and he says stuff like Israel is doing genocide and apartheid, and here's cheap oil for Israel, right? That's the Turkish response. They kill Turkish soldiers, they destroy Turkish equipment, they threaten Turkey. What do? And eventually they're going to be forced to do something. But it might be too late by that time because the Israelis are pushing for what they want. And they don't care that Turkey is not a threat to them at all. It's not a military threat. It's not going to pose a military threat. But they're discussing it as part of the Sunni axis because they don't want an economic competitor. So that's why they're forming their alliances with Greece and Cyprus. That's why they're bombing positions inside of Syria like this. It's all to do with Turkey because, you know, they're not scared of the Syrian military, what it is now, which is just a collection of armed groups which formed into what's now the Syrian military, the new Syrian military. They have no expertise. They don't have strategic weapons. They can't really do very much, right? So they're not really scared of that. What they are scared of is them getting that expertise, them getting those strategic weapons, and then there's a regime change that happens. There's a revolt internally, and someone else takes over in Syria, and suddenly these guys are actually getting directed towards the Golan Heights. That's what they're scared of, right? Right now, they've got their guy. You know, Ahmed al-Shara or Abu Muhammad al-Julani is their guy. So, you know, and he's not really, like, he doesn't have much say. You know, the Turkish government wants to do something. They push him in a certain direction. The Israelis bomb him back in another direction. There's a joint fusion mechanism that the Syrians have signed with the Israelis. So they have intelligence sharing right now. You know, they want to have joint economic projects and a joint economic zone. They're openly saying that they want to have peace with Israel and all of this stuff. You know, and then the followers of Julani and you know, the cultish followers, which is funny because it's literally like idol worship. You know, these people, oh no, everyone else is an idol worshiper. But these people are like idol worshippers. Like, no, he wants to liberate Jerusalem. I don't think we have a different definition of the liberation of Jerusalem. But with that being said, we'll probably get into the Syrian issue a little bit more on another stream. If you got this far into the stream, you want to continue to have more of this analysis, which you're not going to find in the corporate media, and this is why we need independent media. Do consider becoming a member. We are looking for 300 new members. Everyone that's been joining up, you're helping us immensely to keep this show on the air. Again, please, as well, if you like this video, hit that like button. Add a comment below as well. That does help us out in the algorithm. We are getting sort of screwed over by the algorithm at the moment. And as you know, they want to try and suppress channels like this and shows like this. And so it does help us if you put a comment and also share the video with others. Let us know what you think. And thank you for tuning in. We will be back on Monday. Same place, same time, and we will bring you more of what's going on the ground and more analysis.